Well, good day and welcome to all, particularly all guests that are here today. As we've gathered for the offering, the sacrifice, this Mass on the Sunday, perhaps not as warm and sunny as we would like, but the winter is approaching, and now the hard freeze and the growing season is over. But nonetheless, it's bright and sunny in here because we're all gathered together for the offering of this Mass on this Sunday. Our congratulations today go out to Kate Schooley and to Jordan DeZuba. Yesterday, here in the parish church, they were united together in the sacrament of marriage as husband and wife. And please know, after the Mass, we've got different things in the Commons, whether it's the American Heritage Girls or our food baskets for Thanksgiving to give to the needy. And also remind you that we're going to have Mass here on Thanksgiving Day at 9 in the morning. And we have invitation cards. They're on the table as you go out the main doors of the church. I ask you to take some of those cards and start passing them out to people that you know, people particularly they may not have a parish home. And invite them to come and to be with us together on Thanksgiving Day, to begin that day of thanks with a day of prayer, and then with family and with friends afterwards. Today is Veterans Day, November the 11th. It is a day for us as a country in which we pause to give our thanks and to honor for those who have served our nation in times of both war and peace through military service. We have photographs of the sons and daughters of our parish by the entrance of the church, in which we particularly lift them and their families up in prayer today. And as a nation, we say for our veterans, never forget. We should never forget their sacrifice. The sacrifice of them and for their families, in which we thank them for their service. We celebrate this day on November 11th because that is the anniversary of the end of the First World War. On this day, 100 years ago, at the 11th hour, the 11th day, the 11th month, the fighting in what was known as the Western Front, Belgium and France, the guns fell silent. 100 years ago today. That war that went on for 4 years, from 1914 to 1918, claimed an estimated 17 million lives. And that's just an estimate. Another 20 million wounded. Among the survivors of that war was my maternal grandfather. He was only 18 when the war ended, yet he was a combat veteran of the fighting on the Western Front in the German military. He served the Kaiser in that war. The second war, he came to the United States and was going to serve the USA, but his age prevented him from being in active military service. Now, as I said, after the end of the Great War in 1918, 4 years later, my grandfather immigrated to the United States, became a naturalized citizen, and started a whole new life. And because of him, I can wear a shirt at Oktoberfest that says, "Made in America with German parts." I can do so with all legitimacy. I'm not one of these people that I'm Irish for a day or Italian for a day or Mexican for a day. No, I'm a quarter German 24/7, thanks to him. Now, there are many things about his experience during that war that he didn't share with his daughter, my mom, but later on he shared more with me. Maybe the time passed, the decades allowed him to do more of that, speak more of it. War, he said, was a failure of civilization. And he said it also brought out both the best and the worst in you. Among the best was the bond that you shared with your comrades, your fellow soldiers. And I have inherited a number of photographs of my grandfather and his comrades in that period. And it's quite interesting. They're all in uniform, they're young, they look handsome and sharp, and they know it. They just got this air about them, the way they're looking, the way they carry themselves. And chief among them is my grandfather. He was a man who, well, put it this way, he never lacked for self-confidence. Now, the worst that it brought out, the obvious, was that you killed people. You killed other soldiers in combat who were trying to kill you, and you got used to it. That was the reality in which he lived through as a teenager. Another of the worst that it brought out with you, he said, was the temptation to become selfish. Even though you had this strong bond with your comrades, the way he described the warfare is that He said, in the trenches, the man next to you, one minute he was alive, and the next minute he wasn't. So you were tempted, what little you had in terms of your food, maybe things that were sent from home, like special treats like candy or chocolate, or also tobacco. Why share it with somebody who might be dead in a few minutes? So you're tempted to become selfish, to hoard what little you had. The temptation to hoard is not limited to soldiers of a war of a century ago. Some people suffer from a psychological disorder which leads them to hoarding items. In the worst cases of this, people will literally fill their homes from floor to ceiling with what appears to anybody else to be a bunch of junk. There's even a television program called Hoarders. I've seen a few episodes of it. And it almost seems always the person that is doing the hoarding has suffered some kind of trauma, for which they are now trying to compensate. They find a sense of security, false sense of security, by gathering as much stuff, even though others consider it to be junk. They hold on to things, they cling to them to give themselves a disordered sense of comfort and security. Now, it's not only those with such a disorder, or soldiers in trenches of a war long ago, who are tempted to hoard, hold on to things. And by this, I don't mean just merely material items. Each of us faces an illusion. And the illusion is that the best way for us to be happy, to be safe, to be secure, to be fulfilled in our humanity is to hold on to or hoard as much as possible. And what we hoard are usually what I refer to as the usual suspects: power, wealth, status, and pleasure. And the idea is that the more that we have of these items, the more that we hold on to them, the more fulfilling life will be. But this is an illusion. The reality is that no amount of power, wealth, status, or pleasure crammed from floor to ceiling in our lives is ever going to truly satisfy the desire of our hearts. You see, we'll never have enough. We'll be worried about losing what we have. We'll be fixated that somebody else has more than we have. Such is this disordered desire of this illusion. In contrast to this illusion are the two women that we encounter in the scriptures today at Mass. Both of them are widows, which means in this time and place in the scriptures, they are extremely vulnerable. There's no social safety net. For a widow, she didn't have an adult son, brother, father, uncle, somebody taking care of her. She was quite vulnerable of exploitation, starvation, and so on. She's going to be pretty low down on that power, status, wealth, and pleasure ladder. The first widow that we encounter is with the Old Testament prophet Elijah. Now, this action takes place about 9 centuries or so before the birth of Jesus. Elijah has condemned King Ahab and his queen Jezebel for their sins and crimes. Because of it, he's had to flee the country. He's actually gone away out of the country. He's now in Jewish, non-Jewish, or Gentile territory. It's a time of severe drought and famine. The widow that he encounters is literally down to her last bit of food for herself and for her son. What's staring her in the face is death by starvation. She's at the very end of her rope. She's powerless. Now enters Elijah, the prophet, who does not offer her comfort, compassion, or even sympathy. What he says, at least he says, please. He says, please get me some water and some food. We perhaps could not falter if her response was, hey, mister, in case you hadn't heard, there's a famine going on. There's severe drought. There's no food and water to share. If anyone had a valid reason to hoard, cling to the last of what she had, it's this widow. Yet what does Elijah tell her? He uses those words we hear over and over and over again in the scriptures. He says, be not afraid. At that very moment, she has nothing left. she shares the last of what she has. She freely gives it away. And what follows is not starvation and death, but that God provides for her son, and for Elijah for the next year. The widow is an example of a paradoxical and a profoundly spiritual truth. We have the fullness of life not by hoarding or clinging on to those usual suspects of power, wealth, status, pleasure, and so on. Life increases in us in a direct proportion of the amount that we give it away. This is especially the case when it's given as an offering out of love of God and of our neighbor, as we heard in last Sunday's gospel. And sometimes we have to get to that point where we've got nothing left in order to understand that the more that we give away, that's when we're truly blessed. An example of this, interesting enough, we see a parallel to this in all places, American pop culture. By this, I mean the movie It's a Wonderful Life. I know that we associate that movie with Christmas. I know there may be those here today that any reference to Christmas before the celebration of Thanksgiving should be considered a federal offense, punishable by heavy fines and perhaps imprisonment. And believe you, I have sympathies. But just hear me out. Almost all of us have seen this movie, considered now a holiday classic. Remember, the main character is George Bailey. At the very moment when he thinks he's lost everything, it's revealed to him what he actually has. Now, remember how the story ends. No, I don't mean the very ending where Zuzu talks about when the bells ring, the angel gets his wings. Then I start to cry at the end of the movie. I will not ask for a show of hands who else tears up at that moment. But what happens right before? The entire town is gathered at the Bailey home, and George's brother Harry offers a toast. He says, "To my big brother George, the richest man in town." What has made George Bailey rich is not that he clung to power or wealth or status, but rather he gave it away to serve others. Remember, in the story, as a young man, what he wants to do is get out of that town as fast as he can. But he winds up staying there and giving his life over to others, often reluctantly, but he does it nonetheless. He does what we as Catholics should recognize: he's serving the greater common good by doing so. What's made his life wonderful is that he gave it away. The second widow that we hear in the scriptures today, I think, is much like that. The one that Jesus praises in the Gospel of Mark. She gives to the treasury in Jerusalem that's used for the maintenance and also this massive renovation project of the temple, 2 small coins. Her gift is sometimes referred to as the widow's mite. In terms of monetary value, what she gives is worth almost nothing. If there's anybody who could be excused from making a donation, it's her. The annual budget for renovating the temple is not going to rise or fall on her generosity. But she's the one that's praised by Jesus. And she is seen as in direct contrast to the scribes. The scribes, remember, are kind of religious lawyers and scholars. And that anybody that's hoarding on to anything, clinging to anything, it's them. They're hoarding on to their privileged status, to their authority. And in contrast, the widow gives her entire self, all that she has, all that she is, and does it as an offering to God. Now, we don't know what happens to her next. We don't know if she receives some kind of reward or compensation. The Gospels are silent, but no matter. It's her willingness to give of herself completely that causes Jesus to praise her and to see her as a model of discipleship. Living a life in Christ only increases in direct proportion of what we give away, what we share with others. The more that we give of our love, of our joy, of our time, of our faith, of our hope to others, the more it increases in us. That's that profound spiritual truth. Because they're gifts from God. We cannot hoard them. We cannot cling on to them. But we share them out of love of God and neighbor. to do so as disciples of the Lord, thereby to fulfill the desire of our hearts. And all this points to even the greater sacrifice, the greater gift of those of these widows. And that's the gift of Jesus on the cross. The point where he is most powerless. He gives himself over completely to God the Father and to us. As we're told in the letter of the Hebrews, to take away the sins of many. It is the gift of Jesus that he's offered us today in the gift of the Eucharist, his body and blood, soul and divinity. Through this gift, we as his church are now called to make a total gift of ourselves so that his life will be in us. We will have it to the fullest, and our lives will be complete.